anyone with eyes and a microphone was calling Florida State's Friday night date with Virginia a trap, and that is exactly what it ended up being. The Noles have a who's problem and fall in overtime, sliding down the AP poll in the process. And FSU has been on a rankings ride, starting the season unranked. The Alabama win, of course, changed that up to 7 at one point, but a rankings drop was imminent, and that loss slid them down 10 whole spots. And it was to a team that the pollsters now consider a ranked team. Make it make sense here. That's the Florida State ride that they have been on. So let's welcome in Danny Kanell and Chip Patterson to help us get ready for a monster matchup in the ACC between Miami and the aforementioned Florida State Seminoles. Danny, how do you think this FSU team responds to that Friday night loss?
I'm going to take the quarterback's word for it. Thomas Castellanos said he thinks this is going to be a good thing. He had mentioned that they thought the team maybe was starting to read some of the clips, people telling them how good they were, and that this would be the wake-up call that they would need. I would say you don't need any wake-up call for a game against Miami. But I do think this is one where the coaches can get after you now. They can get on you, and you really can't say anything back to them. And now it's kind of, all right, now we've got to prove to the world once again that we're kind of with a Florida State that people thought you were going to get coming into the season. Because after a 2-10 season, there was a lot of question marks coming in. You felt like you answered them with a big win against Alabama, but now they're right back. So I think this should be a good thing. I think Florida State will use this to motivate them, just like Tommy Castellanos mentioned.
Yeah, this is a spot for Florida State where not only did Tommy Castellanos say they'd been reading their own clippings, but they hadn't really gotten to test themselves to see what their weaknesses were. And I think Virginia exposed some flaws, ones that Miami is certainly going to be very aware of. And so now you get to some self-scouting. Then let's be honest, Kent State was not going to give you the self-scouting that you needed to get ready for a top-5 team like Miami. You wish that you'd been able to make that a win that you could coach up on, but instead it's a loss, yet still the opportunity is ahead to accomplish all of the goals, all the championships that you want to try to contend for, but you've got to get it right, and you've got to get it right before Saturday night.
Yeah, taking a loss or two actually worked out for Ohio State and Notre Dame last year, so maybe it'll work out for Florida State. Chip, you mentioned that self-scout. I have to imagine tackling is something that has been brought up in the meeting rooms this week. What are we going to do about that defense? Is this a one-game problem or a real issue for this team?
Emily, that's a burning question going into this game, because to allow more than 200 yards on the ground to Virginia, a lot of them coming from the quarterback Chandler Morris, really contributed to the inability to get off the field defensively. Morris also had some success kind of picking apart the back end of this defense. And for me and my own analysis of Florida State, it really had me going back to my preseason expectations, which I thought that Florida State had done a good job in the transfer portal to bring in pieces. I really liked the hire of Tony White as defensive coordinator, but I wasn't really expecting them to be one of the most dominant defenses in the country. Yet the way that they played against Alabama, oh my goodness, could this be one of the best teams on both sides of the ball? Now we're going up against a Miami team that has one of the best offensive lines in the country. If you're giving up more than 200 yards on the ground to Virginia, that could get very problematic against the Canes as well. You know, the counting stats aren't bad. 25th nationally in yards per play allowed. About 45th nationally in terms of scoring defense. But ultimately, it is what we saw with our eyes. If that defense cannot get off the field, well, then they're not going to give Tommy Castellanos enough chances with the ball to be able to make sure they can win.
Agreed, Chip. That was probably the thing most concerning for me, was the amount of times they got pushed around up front, both sides of the ball. But the offense put up points. Like, the offense did their job. The defense, when they could not get stops, when they mattered the most, critical situations, third downs, red zone. And you mentioned Chandler Morris. That was the one that felt like the backbreaker over and over again, that they just did not account for the QB run game. That is something they won't have to against Miami, but they will have to deal with Mark Fletcher and an offensive line, which I think is going to be even better than Virginia. So the defense has to step up, has to get there. And the one thing that I think concerned Florida State fans was depth along the defensive line. They looked gassed. And so if they're out there again for a lot of time, they don't have the amount of guys to shuttle in when you're getting tired, to have fresh legs coming out there. So they've got to play better along the front four of the defensive line, the front seven across the board, and get off the field so they don't have those long, sustainable drives like they gave up against Virginia.
Yeah, and along those lines, Darrell Jackson Jr., Danny, is your impact player to watch. What do you need to see from the defensive linemen against this stout Miami offensive line?
So, Emily, he was the one for me. In fact, we talked to him after the game in Tallahassee, and as an interior defensive lineman, a defensive tackle, he was the guy that was wreaking havoc in the middle of that defense. So you weren't able to get the ground game going. And then he was pushing forward the middle of the pocket into Ty Simpson's lap, so he couldn't get real comfortable. He's the type of player that was massive expectations coming out of high school. He's a monster of a human being. He's 6'7", 300 pounds. He's got to wreak havoc in the middle of that interior defensive line so they don't get the run game or the pass game going, because no quarterback likes to have guys falling in your lap, whether it's your own offensive lineman getting pushed in your lap or a D tackle pushing the pocket back. He has to have a massive game in this one for Florida State to win.
Yeah, we all know that Tommy Castellanos can have an impact in terms of the winning plays that Florida State needs. But I think in this matchup, we also have to think about the negative impact. And that's where Tommy Castellanos needs to make sure that he is limiting the turnovers. We've seen 3 interceptions for Castellanos so far this season to just 4 passing touchdowns. Obviously, a few more on the ground as well. And look, I'm not going to put those all on him. I remember in the first half against Virginia on Friday night, batted pass ends up getting scooped up by Virginia. Great play by the Wahoo defense right there, but it flashes me back to early in his career with Boston College. 15 touchdowns to 14 interceptions. He's got a little bit of whoopsie daisy in there that we really thought that we had seen in the early part of this season, him start to tighten the screws on that. So Tommy Castellanos is the obvious impact for all the positive things he can do, but he also needs to be an impact player in terms of making sure that he doesn't have the negative plays in what should be a very tightly contested back and forth between these two rivals.
Yeah, one of those interceptions against Virginia was a ball batted down at the line of scrimmage, somebody getting into the backfield. So that might happen again with this Miami defensive front. They are one of the best, if not the best, in the country. So, Chip, how does Florida State match up with that front?
Well, this is going to be very, very tough for them to be able to hold up along the lines of scrimmage, because Miami, for my money, is the best team in the country when you combine offensive and defensive line. And it's something that Mario Cristobal has built up. You know, the former offensive line coach at Alabama. This is something where he has, I think, very artfully blended old school mentality of what he remembers from playing at Miami with trying to push this thing forward. And what I mean by that is that he wants to be physical. He wants to be able to mash you at the line of scrimmage, but he allows Shannon Dawson and he allows his his defensive coordinator, Corey Heatherman, to be able to apply some advanced schemes. So we are using a little bit of tempo. We are throwing it around on offense, and yet defensively, now that we've got Ruben Bain finally healthy, Akeem Messidor is really stepping up, and I think that on the interior of that defensive line, we've seen some of those transfer portal additions step up. This is the closest thing to Mario Cristobal's ideal of what Miami football should be in 2025, and it starts right there in the trenches.
Oh, yeah, this is a Cristobal dream, looking at those big uglies on both sides of the line of scrimmage. Switching over to the Miami conversation, that is who, of course, Florida State is playing in this big game. And some of us might remember the last time Beck played Florida State. It did not go well for the Noles. That was the 2023 Orange Bowl. Georgia won that 63-3. Danny, I know Florida State remembers it. I know Carson Beck remembers it, but that was 2 years ago. So how do you evaluate Carson Beck here in 2025 so far?
That was 2 years ago, entirely different stage, but it wasn't the same stadium where he's been crushing it this year. This will be his first road test with the Miami Hurricanes, and Carson Beck has been outstanding. I've been really impressed with his ability to pick up the system that they're running, with his ability to find some continuity with Malachi Toney and CJ Daniels and their other offensive weapons, but maybe most importantly, the leadership that he's displayed. That was a question mark I openly had for him and wondered about, why would Georgia let him walk out the door? Why did his Georgia teammates, not act more upset when he was lost for the season? But he has infused some life, and there has been no doubt who's the leader of this offense. And I saw it on display multiple times this season, whether it was against Florida, where he wasn't shining, didn't have his best game, or against USF, where he did absolutely go out there and ball. It was that emotional leader. So he's just got to keep doing the things he's been doing, and most importantly, not turn the ball over, which he's been better with the football this year than he was at Georgia last year. So I've been really, really impressed with the way Carson Beck has had command of that offense and has led the team around him.
Speaking of the team around him, he's got a lot of pieces on offense to throw to. How about Malachi Nelson? Oh, my goodness, that is your impact player to watch, Chip. Malachi Toney.
I mean,
Wrong,
I got a
Nelson.
little spark. I mean, just thinking about Malachi Toney, because the thing is he's got that shiftiness, Emily. You know, he's got that playmaking ability. And that was one thing that while Miami had a lot of NFL pass catchers last year, you know, the Xavier Restrepo, what he was able to do in the slot, he was very crafty. But Malachi Toney is different because not only is he crafty, not only can they move him around the offense, but he's got that take your breath away kind of speed and playmaking. And as a freshman, since we saw him in the opener against Notre Dame, he has been fearless. He is ready for the moment. He is the team leader in receptions. He is the team leader in receiving yards. He's averaging more than 12 yards a reception. And I just think that the future for him is so bright. And that is going to be something where this Florida State pass defense that was picked apart just a little bit by Chandler Morris, you always have to be aware of where he is because they're going to try to hide him. And then they're going to try to make sure that you see him, AKA the back of his jersey, as he's breaking free for a long play.
No doubt. Chip, for my impact players for Miami, it's the two edge rushers. It's Ruben Bain and Akeem Mesidor. You mentioned them earlier in the show. They have been absolutely wreaking havoc and just absolutely crushing opposing quarterbacks. Ruben Bain is one of those players. He's intimidating to look at. He's got that thick lower half. He plays so low to the ground. He gets that bend coming off the edge. But the one thing I think Florida State has to be aware of, because they're not going to sit there and just and just kick back an offensive tackle and just have him sitting in the pocket, Tommy Castellanos. That's the key for me for Florida State to defend Ruben Bain. Sure, you could have tight end Chip with him or a back Chip. I think it's move the pocket, make sure Tommy Castellanos isn't a sitting target in the pocket. So Ruben Bain is a player that can absolutely change the outcome of this game from the defensive standpoint, and I'm sure Florida State will have a game plan for him.
Starting to get some Heisman whispers, get a little bit more buzz depending on how he plays this Saturday. But Danny, I want to know who wins this football game.
Oh, Emily.
Who's
You know, I
mean,
I do have to make sure that I am just, non-partial in this one and take off my homer Alf. I think Florida State bounces back. This is a place where they did have that huge game against Alabama. I think you get the best effort, and I do think it'll have to be a higher scoring game in order to do so. So I've got Florida State winning 30-27, kind of a hang-on classic Miami versus Florida State rivalry game. I think Florida State gets it done at home, though.
I'm going to go with Miami 30-28. We hadn't talked about this yet, DK. It seems like we're seeing the same game with a who scores last, who makes the last mistake. It is going to be one where I am going to say we have 4 different lead changes, multiple ties, but you're holding my feet to the fire on Monday, and I'm going to go with the team that is built as well as anybody along the lines of scrimmage and a quarterback who has just a little bit more seasoning when it comes to winning these biggest games. So I will go with the U getting it done in Tallahassee 30-28.
I like that you both at least picked some tight games because as an impartial viewer, that's what I want to see. And Danny, of course, you got to pick Florida State here because you're headed that way. You need to make sure that you are welcomed home again. You guys are going to be there. The Cover 3 podcast hitting the road. You can watch them live at Madison Social in Tallahassee Friday, October 3rd at 3 o'clock Eastern.